Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. Happy Monday morning to you. I appreciate you being with me. Hope you had a fantastic weekend. And we are continuing our study of the Olivet Discourse, and we've been focused on the Great Tribulation. Now, very quickly, let me remind you that the connection between the Great Tribulation and the law of Moses is so absolutely critically important. By the way, just last week I posted an article on my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and in that article entitled No Torah, No Tribulation, I document for you from Scripture with very clear scriptural attestation that it would be as a direct result of Israel's abominable actions that tribulation would come. That's the connection that is found throughout Scripture. While certainly foreign nations could commit abominable acts, okay, and be judged for those abominable acts. In Matthew chapter 24, the abomination would be in the holy place. In other words, having to do with Israel. And that abomination would lead directly to the Great Tribulation. Now, there is another connection that I'm telling you, this was one of those holy cow moments. And that is the direct, inseparable, and unbreakable connection between the Great Tribulation and the resurrection. And in my book, The Resurrection of Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2, Fulfilled or Future, I developed this connection extensively. One passage after another. And not only the connection between the Great Tribulation and the resurrection, the inseparable connection between the time of judgment on Israel and Jerusalem, i.e. as the Great Tribulation, and the resurrection. Now, I told you I'm going to keep this relatively brief, and I will. But one of those passages that is absolutely incredibly clear is Isaiah 24 and 25. In Isaiah chapter 24, you have the destruction of the land. You have the destruction of the people who dwell in the midst of the land. They dwell in the city that dwells in the midst of the land, that city of confusion. Well, what is the city of confusion that dwelt in the midst of the land inhabited by the people? You know who that is. At the time of that destruction, guess what? The Lord would rule gloriously in Zion, and the temple would be destroyed. The city would be turned over to foreigners, but God would destroy death. Here's the destruction and judgment of Jerusalem and the temple and resurrection. Well, anyway, that's ever so brief, but again, I develop it fully in this book, The Resurrection of Daniel chapter 12. But we began in our last study looking at Daniel chapter 12. I demonstrated to you that Daniel chapter 12 verse 1 says, "At that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince, who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was, since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time your people shall be delivered." Everyone who is found written in the book. Now, I pointed out to you that men such as John Collins, noted author, and former preterist Sam Frost say that at that time refers to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. I demonstrated for you how many Bible commentators, how many historians point back up to verse 29 and following as a transition from a focus on the ascendancy of Antiochus Epiphanes and a focus on his time to the time of the Romans. I pointed out to you how Gaius Popilius Laenas drew a circle around Antiochus on the beach at Alexandria, Egypt. and told him to either go to war with Rome or back off. He backed off. Rome was now in the ascendancy. That's the focus of at that time. So that puts Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, in the days of Rome. Well, that means that Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, belongs to the days of Rome. Now, it is absolutely stunning to see how the commentators overlook, they ignore, or they deny this connection. At that time, there shall be a time of great tribulation, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall arise. So commentators, they come to Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. Now, let it be noted that many commentators see that Daniel chapter 12, verse 1 is reference to the Jewish war. But then they ignore verse 2. You know, it's fascinating. Kenneth Gentry once took Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 as a, quote, undeniable reference, unquote, to the resurrection of physical bodies at the end of time. Now, amazingly enough, when confronted with the internal evidence of Daniel chapter 12, Kenneth Gentry has now adopted the full preterist view, that Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 refers to a spiritual resurrection in the first century fulfilled by AD 70. Yes, he does, unless he's changed again. The attempt to divide Daniel chapter 12, verse 1 from Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 is one of those, what do I call it? Argumentum ad desperatum, arguments from desperation. Because you see, most commentators know that Jesus posited the Great Tribulation for the first century generation, not for 2,000 years and counting. The Great Tribulation was not to be a process of 2,000 years. It was to belong to the first century, to the judgment on Israel and Jerusalem and the Jews. Okay. Let me illustrate the radical change that has taken place. Sam Frost, now former preterist, wrote in his book, had it laying right here, yes, in his book, Essays on the Resurrection, page 119, quote, "It is clear that both the Hebrew wa and the Greek kai, translated as and, connect," do you catch the power of what he's saying? Connect verse 1 and 2. What is Mr. Frost doing? He is appealing to the grammar, the actual text of Daniel chapter 12. He continues, Daniel connects tribulation and the resurrection and those written in the book. As Preston observes in his book, Who is This Babylon? 2006, page 63, John specifically posits fulfillment of the salvation of the 144,000 in the first century. He tells us in Revelation 14, 2-4, that the 144,000 were the, quote, first fruits of those redeemed to God from men, unquote. In other words, they're the first generation of the Jewish church. But again, remember that John, like Daniel, links their salvation with tribulation, the tribulation, and the resurrection. This demands that the resurrection was to be in the first century, unquote. Again, page 119 of this book. I copied it off put it in large print for ease. Ease of reading. Now, Mr. Frost's current position is, well, verse 1 of Daniel chapter 12 refers to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Verse 2, however, that's a parenthetical insertion into the text about the end of human history. The end of time. What happened to the appeal to the grammar? Now watch this. At that time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of the people, and, well, does that connect it with at that time? Of course it does. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even at that time, and that connects it as well. At that time, and at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who's found written in the book, and, you see, the resurrection is linguistically and grammatically being linked to, and at that time your people shall be delivered, those who are written in the book, and those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall arise. You see, grammatically, verse 1 and verse 2 are connected. Just as Mr. Frost wrote in his excellent book, Exegetical Essays on the Resurrection. Now, when Mr. Frost has made this argument that verse 1 is at the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, verse 2 is the end of time, on Facebook I've challenged him repeatedly, over and over and over again, to provide the grammatical justification for that delineation, the linguistic justification for divorcing verse 1 from verse 2, the contextual demand for dividing verse 2 from verse 1, or from what follows for that matter, as we shall see. I have asked Mr. Frost over and over and over. And by the way, he's not the first one I've asked. In numerous formal public debates, I've asked my opponents, for instance, Mr. Wallace in Salt Lake City a few years ago, and I'll talk about that tomorrow. He took verse 1 as the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, verse 2 the end of time. When I challenged him over and over and over again to justify that, totally stone dead silent. Just like Mr. Frost has been in my Facebook exchanges with him, asking him for his proof. You know what his proof has been? Well, Daniel chapter 12 verse 2 is obviously about the raising of physical bodies. I'm sorry, folks, that is what you call petitio principii. It's begging the question. It's assuming something to be true without proving it to be true. It's presuppositional is what it is. When you ask for grammatical proof, for linguistic proof, for contextual proof, for textual proof, and all you get is, oh, well, it's true because I say it's true. I'm sorry, that doesn't work. Here's the point, among others. Daniel chapter 12, verse 1 and verse 2 are connected with that connective particle, wa in the Hebrew and kai in the Greek. The use of and in verse 1 and 2 connect them together. They are inseparable. That means that the time of the Great Tribulation is the time of the resurrection. The time of the resurrection is the time of the Great Tribulation. By the way, I've shared with you, this is the Hebrew narrative of eschatology. Virtually the unbroken testimony of the ancient Hebrews was that the time of the Great Tribulation would lead directly to, it's inseparable from the resurrection. So, ironically enough, Mr. Frost, who constantly likes to appeal to the ancient sources, history, in this instance, guess what he wants to do? He wants to completely ignore or deny or distort that unbroken Jewish testimony about the connection between the Great Tribulation and the resurrection. And oh, by the way, that Hebrew eschatological timeline and narrative, that is the timeline of Scripture, as I prove in my book. I had it right here on Daniel chapter 12. I don't know how. Do you ever do that? You lay something down. I do that with tools in my garage all the time. Anyway, you lay it down, you go back, it's not there. I don't know how that happened. I had it right here, covered up. Okay, in my book, the resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, fulfilled or future. I show passage after passage after passage, as I've already noted this morning, that connect the time of the Great Tribulation with the resurrection, and that time of Great Tribulation as the time of judgment on Israel. Folks, I'm sorry. That connection is inviolable. It is inseparable and it is irrefutable. Now, here's what that means. In regard to our study of the Olivet Discourse, Jesus posited the Great Tribulation and the parousia coming in that generation. His coming in judgment of Jerusalem in that generation. If Jesus posited the tribulation for his generation, that means he was positing the resurrection for his generation. You know, not long ago on Facebook, and I'm taking too much time this morning, but not long ago on Facebook, someone said there, where in the world do you find resurrection in Matthew chapter 24? When I pointed that out, where it was and is in Matthew 24, they completely abandoned the discussion. Anyway, since tribulation and resurrection are inextricably bound up together, that means that since Jesus was predicting the tribulation for his generation, and by the way, the amillennialists and the postmillennialists agree with that, then that means he was positing the resurrection for his generation, and that means that the Olivet Discourse cannot be divided. It's one united discourse. Well, I've taken too much time this morning, but this is great stuff. I will continue my discussion of Daniel chapter 12 and the tribulation and the resurrection tomorrow. I'll see you on the flip side.